Take Me Out to the Ball Game, the unofficial anthem of baseball, gets sung out loud by everybody at once in the middle of the seventh inning in Major League Baseball parks all over America. There is no band and there is no rehearsal. The groundskeepers walk out with the drag mats, the music starts, and everybody in the place stands up and sings the same song at the same time. The song is from 1908. It is older than every ballpark in the major leagues, older than Fenway, older than Wrigley. And for the first 68 years of its life, the crowd stayed quiet through it. What changed that was one microphone, wired into a broadcast booth in Chicago in 1976 and switched on in the middle of an inning. The man on the other end of that microphone was Caray, and the reason the owner of that ball club put it there is a stranger story than the trick. A baseball game has 9 innings, and each one has 2 halves. Somewhere in the middle of the 7th, once the visiting team has finished batting, everybody in the ballpark stands up. That is the whole tradition. Stand up, get the stiffness out, sit back down. It has been happening in one form or another since before anybody alive today was born, and for most of that history, nobody sang a note. Some parks add a tune of their own on the end of it. In Baltimore, they follow it with "Thank God I'm a Country Boy." In Milwaukee, they follow it with "Roll Out the Barrel," and it turns into a polka. But the song that comes first, the one that turns up in city after city with everybody joining in, came out of one ballpark on the south side of Chicago. In 1976, that ballpark was Comiskey Park, and the White Sox played in it. The organist was a woman named Nancy Faust, hired 6 years earlier out of a luncheonette job, who would go on to play more than 3,000 games for that club. In the middle of the 7th, she played "Take Me Out to the Ball Game" the way ballpark organists had played it for decades, as background, as something to fill the gap while people stretched. Up in the broadcast booth was Caray, who called the games. Caray sang along with her, not for the crowd and not into a microphone. He sang into the air of a booth where only his broadcast partners could hear him, and by his own account, it was the only song whose words he actually knew. The club had just been bought by Bill Veeck, an owner famous across baseball for stunts, giveaways, and an exploding scoreboard. Veeck looked over at the booth and noticed 2 things at once. He noticed Caray mumbling the song, and he noticed that a handful of people in the seats directly below the booth were mumbling it back at him. Caray put the number at about 8. The following night, a public address microphone was wired into that booth. The story Caray told for the rest of his life is that nobody warned him it was there. The organ started, and his own voice came booming back at him with the crowd singing underneath it. It stayed. From that night on, people at Comiskey expected it. Then in 1982, Caray changed clubs and went across town to the Cubs, and he took it with him, and that is the move that made it national. Because the Cubs were on WGN, and WGN was a superstation, which meant a Chicago station that cable carried into the entire country. So Caray, who by 1989 would receive the Ford C. Frick Award from the Baseball Hall of Fame, was leaning out of a window at Wrigley Field with a microphone in his fist, conducting a full ballpark through a waltz written before the First World War, going out live to living rooms in Texas and Oregon and Maine on an ordinary weekday afternoon for 16 years. What traveled on WGN was not really the song. The song was already everywhere. What traveled was the picture. A man hanging out of a booth, waving a microphone like a baton, and a whole ballpark following him. And it spread the way things spread on television. Other clubs watched it work and moved it into the 7th. Some had been playing something else there and swapped it out. Some kept both. And a ritual that belonged to one ballpark in Chicago ended up belonging to the sport. Which leaves the question the whole thing actually rests on. Why this one? A ballpark plays music all night long and hardly anybody sings along to any of it. So why does everybody sing at the 7th? Part of the answer is the inning, and the inning is much older than the song. The stretch has at least 3 origin stories, and nobody has ever settled them. The most repeated one involves Brother Jasper, a Christian brother who ran both the baseball team and the discipline at Manhattan College in New York, and who on a hot afternoon in 1882 is said to have stopped play and told his restless students to get up and shake it out. The New York Giants are supposed to have seen it at an exhibition game and carried it away with them. The second involves President William Howard Taft, who in 1910 stood up in the middle of the seventh at a game in Washington, and the crowd, thinking he was leaving, rose out of respect. It is a good story, and it is told everywhere. It is also not where this began. The third is a letter. In 1869, Harry Wright, who ran the Cincinnati Red Stockings, the first professional baseball team in America, wrote a letter describing spectators rising between the halves of the seventh, stretching out their arms and legs, and walking about to get the ache out of their backs. That is 13 years before Brother Jasper and 41 years before Taft. And it is not a legend. It is a man writing down what he had seen. So the pause was already there, and it had been there a long time. The song arrived decades after that, off a subway train. In the spring of 1908, a vaudeville lyricist named Jack Norworth was riding the New York subway when he passed a sign advertising a game. Baseball today, Polo Grounds. He had never been to one in his life. He took out a scrap of paper and wrote the whole thing in under half an hour, then handed it to a composer, Albert von Tilzer, who set it to a waltz. Both men were fixtures of Tin Pan Alley, the commercial songwriting world that was turning out the popular music of America at the time. On the 2nd of May, the Copyright Office in Washington received 2 copies of a song about a young woman who would rather be taken to the ballpark than to a show. The first known recording was cut that same year by a singer named Edward Meeker, and then it went into vaudeville houses and Nickelodeons and piano rolls, and it stayed there. The first known time anybody played it at a baseball game was 1934, 26 years after it was written, at a high school game in Los Angeles. 2 accounts of the night that microphone went on in Chicago survive, and they do not agree. Caray always told it as an ambush, the microphone hidden and switched on with nobody warned. Bill Veeck's son Mike, who was working for his father at the time, has said his father asked first, and Caray flatly refused him. Nobody has reconciled the two, and this film is not going to either. But both versions agree on the reasoning, and the reasoning is the whole thing. One favor before the last part. Press subscribe on the screen if you're on the television, just under the video if you're on a phone. Because the reason they all join in is not the song. Veeck had wanted a ballpark full of people singing for years and had never found anyone who could make it happen. Caray remembered him saying afterwards, "I have been looking for 45 years for the right man." Caray, being human, took that as a compliment about his voice. It was not one. Veeck told him he had been chosen precisely because he was bad at it. A good voice, he said, would have shut the place up. That was the whole theory. People do not join in behind a professional. They join in behind somebody they are quietly confident they could beat. That is the design. The reason an entire American ballpark will sing out loud, in broad daylight, in front of everybody in it, is that the man put in front of them was selected for being worse at it than they were. It is a ritual with the embarrassment engineered out of it. Both men, in their different ways, had worked out the same thing about a ballpark. The most important people in it were never the ones on the field. Harry Caray died in February of 1998, and the Cubs had a decision to make about the middle of the seventh. They could have retired it. They could have played a recording of him every night and left it at that. What they did instead was hand the microphone to somebody else, and then to somebody else again the next game, and the game after that. His widow, Dutchie Caray, went first, on opening day. Since then, it has been former players, broadcasters, film stars, coaches, and a long line of local people nobody outside Chicago has ever heard of, at home game after home game, for coming up on 30 years. Some of them are terrible. That is not a fault in the system. That is the system, working on exactly the principle Bill Veeck landed on in a Chicago ballpark in 1976. And you can walk into this. Buy the cheapest seat in almost any big league park in the country, wait for the visitors to be retired in the seventh, and stand up when everybody around you stands up. Nobody is going to check whether you can sing. That was never the requirement. The requirement is only that you are there, and that when it starts, you don't stay quiet. If you want more American stories told this way, subscribe. I'll see you at the next one.